positions. And Mr. Wallace, 1 minute.
Thank you to our hosts, and thank you all for coming. When I was a young lawyer working in the U.S. Senate, I never dreamed of today's hyper-partisan imbalance in Washington. I was hired by moderate Republicans to write bills to fix big problems. Nobody ever asked what my party registration was. I was there to write legislation to help millions of people. We passed compensation for Agent Orange, veterans exposed to it and damaged by it. We passed comprehensive crime control. We passed the Missing Children's Act. And we did it through careful, painstaking analysis of facts and science and costs and benefits. And from that came bipartisan consensus. Now, why can't we do that today? Why can't we do that anymore? Because corporate money has bought politicians. We can't have action on the people's business, skyrocketing healthcare costs, clean air and water, gun violence. Instead, we get tax cuts for billionaires and the corporations and ask the rest of us to pay for it through cuts to Social Security and Medicare. Thank you.
Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Good morning, everybody. Sandy, Carlo, thank you for hosting us. Dr. Gallup and Delaware Valley University, a phenomenal organization, which I'm a proud supporter of. And thank you all for being here and being involved in your democracy. The fact that you're all here at 8 o'clock in the morning tells me all I need to know about everybody in this room. I'm Brian Fitzpatrick. I spent 14 years in the FBI, the only job I wanted to do since I was this big. LA, New York City, everywhere in between, Europe, Africa, Asia, Middle East, working counterterrorism, counterintelligence, cybersecurity, incredibly important cases, working with the most amazing women and men I've ever known. I am a member of the Problem Solvers Caucus. It's the only bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus in Congress. 24 Democrats, 24 Republicans. Every bill we advance is bipartisan in nature. And we have the most independent district in the United States of America. And your representative was ranked #1 most independent freshman congressman in the entire nation. The problem solvers are going to come up frequently today. It is the only thing that will save our country. And Scott and I had a debate last week, Sunday. His comment, he said he's on the Democrat team and I'm on the Republican team. I think that exhibits the problem right there. And that's what we're going to be talking about today for the rest of this campaign and throughout the debate we have in this, as far as the future of the Congress goes. We got to get away from that stuff, and that's what the problem solvers stand for. Thank you.
90-second questions. Mr. Wallace. Tax reform. A major piece of legislation to pass this Congress was the first fundamental rewrite of the tax code since 1986. Small businesses utilizing these pro-growth changes to the tax code have created jobs across America. Will you support extending it, making those individual and pass-through rates cuts for individuals and small business permanent?
I will not support any bill that adds another $3 trillion to the national debt unless we have some plan to pay for it. The last tax bill we passed added $2 trillion to the national debt, and it has not been paid for. And now we have Mitch McConnell going in front of the American people and Paul Ryan, who was here yesterday doing a nice fundraiser for my esteemed opponent, saying that we have to now cut entitlements, as they put it, as the rest of us put it, earned benefits. They have to cut Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid to pay for it. The budget resolution approved by the House Budget Committee recently has a $1.5 trillion cut to Medicaid, $500 billion cut to Medicare, and I will not support something that is not paid for. It was not correct when they said that the tax bill would pay for itself through economic growth. Current projections are the CBO estimated 1.9% growth. A recent analysis by the Wall Street Journal of 60 leading economists in America said long-term growth over the next 6 years will be 1.8%. We have a huge hole in the debt, and I will support some cutting back of the tax cut that was initially enacted.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Fitzpatrick, you want the question?
Sorry?
You want that question repeated, or
Sure.
Okay?
No, good. So we had a tax code that was written in 1986, 31 years ago, when nobody had a computer in their home, when digital communications didn't exist. Our corporate tax rate was 35%, highest in the world by a mile. Our neighbors to the north, Canada, 18%. Ireland 12.5%, Russia, for crying out loud, 20%. We had a 35% corporate tax rate, brought that down to 21%, modernized the code after a decade of a GDP growth rate that was growing at 1.5, 1.6%. Last year, 2.7%. Last quarter, 4.2%. We needed to do something to jumpstart this economy, and everybody is benefiting. 3.7 unemployment rate, 3.7%, lowest since 1969. We were just renamed the #1 most competitive country in the world. Everybody knows the economy is doing well. We had to jumpstart the economy, and the biggest threat we have to all of our programs, the biggest challenge of funding environmental preservation, education, public education, our social safety net, the biggest threat is an economy that is growing at 1.6%, having been through one round of budget battles. That is a fiscally and financially unsustainable growth clip. The estimates that he's talking about predicted a 1.9% growth in GDP. 1 year, 2.7%. Last year, 4.2% last quarter. That's what we need. And anybody that wants the answer to the question, walk down Mill Street in Bristol Borough, 58 storefronts or so, there's 3 vacancies. Help wanted signs in every other store. That's economic growth. That's what we needed to do.
Mr. Fitzpatrick, this is for you. Question number 2 is about health care. You will have an opportunity to directly impact the legislative and administrative opportunities to provide small business with cost-effective solutions to provide health insurance for small business owners and their employees. What are you planning on advocating?
So the problem solvers, I voted, as everybody here knows, against both of the repeal attempts and the budget vehicle that led to the attempted repeal. I'm a believer in identifying what works and keeping it, identifying what's broken and fixing it. I don't believe in single-payer health care. I don't believe in the Wild West. The point of equilibrium, the most important thing, and the problem solvers identified several key components: fully funding cost-sharing reimbursements, eliminating the 2.3% medical device tax, allowing for interstate competition. In 1/3 of the counties in this country, there's one insurance provider. I don't care what the product is. If there's only one place to go get it, the cost is going to be high. Having state stability funds and state reinsurance funds to help fund things like pre-existing conditions, and allowing for association health plans. These are common sense steps, and the most important thing is medical liability reform. In states like Pennsylvania, there is no cap on non-economic damages. Think of what that does to medical insurance premiums for physicians who are fleeing Pennsylvania because of this. If we cap non-economic damages, medical insurance premiums will go down, the defensive practice of medicine will stop. There's not a physician that won't tell you that they don't order tests, order scripts in order to protect themselves from liability. That puts a tremendous burden on the healthcare system, and that's what's got to change.
Thank you. Mr. Wallace, do you want the question? Are you okay?
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
On what do we do about healthcare in this country? The healthcare system that we have, the Affordable Care Act, is being dismantled bit by bit, piece by piece. Brian Fitzpatrick voted for the tax bill, which, as Donald Trump said, cut the heart out of Obamacare, out of the Affordable Care Act, the repeal of the individual mandate. There is litigation going on right now in Texas, filed by 20 state attorneys general and 2 governors, to say that the repeal of the individual mandate makes the entirety of Obamacare unconstitutional. And the U.S. Attorney General, Sessions, filed a brief in that case saying, well, at the very least, it makes protections for pre-existing conditions unconstitutional. I have not heard a peep of protest out of Mr. Fitzpatrick about this position of our government saying that pre-existing conditions protections must go away, and the rest of the suit which says the entire thing is unconstitutional. He in fact voted on the floor of the House on May 4th, 2017, for a bill that would prevent protections for pre-existing conditions. And there was a long debate about should we do that or not? What will it do to the protections for 52% of Bucks Countyans who have pre-existing conditions? And it was opposed by the American Medical Association, the Heart Association, the Lung Association, the Cancer Association. It was all on the table, and he voted to prevent that amendment from coming up to the Ryan healthcare bill.
Mr. Wallace. No, I'm sorry. Mr. Wallace. We're going to move on to a regulatory burdens question. continued work to roll back excessive burdens from previously promulgated regulations that interfere with the ability of companies to do business and create jobs. Do you support these burdens?
I support reasonable regulation that protects people's health and safety in this country. Workplace safety, clean air, clean water, they mean a lot to the people of this district. These regulations were not written to injure business. They were not written to damage jobs. They were written to protect important values in America. Clean water here in Central Bucks is an existential threat to 70,000 households. Clean water, protecting the climate. And we're seeing the effect in these superstorms. Regulations are not written out of whim or malice. They're written to protect people, workplace safety. So I do not look at these, and I know that in the Obama White House they had a whole office devoted to making sure that the regulations were as least burdensome as possible on business and as least costly in terms of jobs and productivity. So yes, I oppose some of the regulations that Mr. Fitzpatrick has voted for, particularly in the environmental area, to deregulate clean air and clean water and allow restrictions on renewable energy. I support a 100% transition to renewable energy by 2030 to work for climate change and renewable jobs.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Everything he just told you about pre-existing conditions is a lie. Everything you just said. I am the co-sponsor. First of all, I voted against both repeal attempts, and I'm the co-sponsor of Bill 1121, which will protect pre-existing conditions in perpetuity. So Scott, I don't know what bill you're referring to. Maybe you can give me the number?
That was a sense of the House resolution, completely non-binding. It doesn't do a thing, and you know it.
1121? Not true. And if you can give me the bill number of any time I've ever voted against pre-existing conditions, you don't have it because it doesn't exist.
I know how you voted.
And you obviously don't. And you have something in the back, which we'll give to everybody here if they want, a Washington Post article that says he's lying about it. It says it's a completely false attack. Of course I support protection for pre-existing conditions. Of course I do. It's one of the many reasons why I voted against 2 attempts to repeal the Affordable Care Act, and I'm the co-sponsor of 1121, which will provide in perpetuity protection for pre-existing conditions. Washington Post articles in the back, Scott. That is an attack that you've repeated consistently, and it is 1,000% false.
Mr. Fitzpatrick, please.
Yep.
Question for you. Government fiscal stability. How will you persuade Congress to follow regular order on fiscal policy, including the timely passage of a budget resolution and spending bills, all with a view towards fiscal restraint, and urge Congress and the administration to elevate the discussion on reforming entitlement programs?
Yep. So 2 things. Number 1, the problem solvers. We've developed bipartisan solutions on gun violence, on transportation infrastructure, on prison reform, on health care and immigration. We've agreed as a bipartisan caucus, right of center, left of center, centrist representatives on the way forward. In order to get these bills to the floor of the House, there's something called the Break the Gridlock package. We have all committed as a caucus to only support a speaker candidate in the next Congress that is going to agree to these rules changes, which will bring back regular order, which would allow every one of the 435 members of Congress to actually have a voice in Congress, giving them a minimum of 1 identified district priority where they will get a full committee markup, full floor vote on the House of Representatives. Should have been the rule instituted a long time ago, hasn't been. That's very important to return to regular order, and that's how we're going to get these bipartisan bills back, including things like the balanced budget amendment, which I'm a big believer of, a common sense piece of legislation that says as a practice, we're going to make sure that revenues and expenses match each other. And that's focused on the revenue side. It's focused on economic growth. It doesn't need to be cutting expenses. If you expand the economy to the clip at which we plan to grow it at 3 and 4% a year, the revenues will come in, and we're already seeing that.
Thank you. Mr. Wallace?
I agree it is essential to be responsible about a balance between money coming in and money going out. I think it was utterly irresponsible to vote for the tax bill, which exploded our debt by $2 trillion, and we have not yet paid for it. I am extremely disappointed to hear the Republicans plan to pay for it out of Social Security and Medicare, to take it out of the 99% to pay to the 1%. Brian Fitzpatrick voted for that. That is not solving problems. That is part of voting 85% with Donald Trump. You can talk about bipartisanship all you want. You can talk about being right down the middle. But if you're 85% with Donald Trump, time and again, you are part of the problem. And now we're voting for another $3 trillion in tax cuts that aren't paid for, on top of the $2 trillion, and this from the party that preaches fiscal responsibility. What is the solution? I say make the rich pay their fair share. We gave them a tax cut they didn't need, they didn't ask for, they don't want, they don't need. And we gave corporations a record tax cut, a 15% tax cut. Now some corporations are paying zero taxes because we didn't do anything about the loopholes. Jared Kushner, by the way, has apparently not paid any taxes at all for the last several years. We have to cut the loopholes and we have to make the rich pay their fair share.
Mr. Wallace, this is for you. Small businesses agree that the American workforce must focus on identifying the skills and education needed to prepare American workers to compete in the 21st century. What actions will you take to prepare the next generation to be gainfully employed?
Well, I am a huge supporter of the 3 terrific vocational technical schools here in Bucks County. That is a great solution to get the large chunk of our kids who are not necessarily college bound for a 4-year liberal arts degree and a degree in philosophy or sociology, to get them an employable skill within high school years, where they can come out with a skill that is matched to a trade because it was designed by the board of these schools, which are local business and industry leaders. We should be moving toward debt-free graduation from public colleges and universities in Pennsylvania. I support that. When I went to law school, the total tuition was $2,500 a year. You could literally work your way through school with a part-time job at McDonald's. We've got to get back to college affordability. When I worked as an outside advocate for some civil and constitutional rights groups, I worked 3 years with the Congress to get passed legislation to provide student loan forgiveness for students who promised to take up a job as a prosecutor or public defender in public service. Because I saw these kids graduating with $200,000 in debt, and here they're expected to take a public interest job that pays $30,000. And the temptation to go off and work for a corporation is huge. So I praise and admire their public spiritedness. So we worked and we got past debt forgiveness for those kids, and I think we can do more of that for public service jobs in America and state and government-run colleges and universities.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Fitzpatrick?
7.1 million unfilled jobs in this country. 2 reasons. Number 1, inability to pass a drug test. Second reason is a skills gap. We were at Bucks County Community College yesterday. They are starting a brand new program with a brand new facility that's going to address this. The week before that, we gave a $1.7 million grant, Department of Labor grant, to the Workforce Training and Development Program in Bucks County. The overwhelming majority of guidance offices in this district and across the country, their metric of success is placement in 4-year colleges and universities. They're not giving these kids that alternative path, like the ones that I saw, the sheet metal workers facility in Philadelphia, kids graduating at 18 years old, entering apprenticeship programs, $60,000 a year to start, college tuition for the apprenticeship program, 5 years they graduate, no college debt, sometimes making $90,000, $100,000 a year. That is a great alternative path to give these kids. We're blessed to have free training facilities, tech schools in this district. So that's the answer to that question. I want to revisit the tax question. I want everybody here to know that the old tax code benefited people like Mr. Wallace here, who inherited hundreds of millions of dollars. And every forum I'm going to be at, I'm going to reinstitute this challenge, Scott. We can solve this question very easily. We don't need to hypothesize. I can give my tax returns, you can give yours. Delaware Valley can calculate the numbers, old tax code, new tax code, and see who benefited under what code. I will tell you the answer. And he could blow this campaign wide open right now if he wanted to, but he's not going to do it. He won't give his tax returns because under the old code, he paid a lower rate than every single one of you in this room.
Thank you.
Every single one of you.
Mr. Fitzpatrick, for you, energy question. Energy independence is clearly a national objective and a serious topic of political discussion. Reliable and affordable energy impacts all of us on a daily basis and gives us the way of life we enjoy. How can the United States how can the United States become and stay energy independent given the regulatory burdens, limitations on drilling, and discussions of climate change?
Well, we need to get to energy independence, and we are way behind the curve on that, and it's been going on for a while. This is one thing where green energy jobs are the fastest sector of growth in our economy. So these are not mutually exclusive, and gone are the days where you had to make a mutually exclusive choice of protecting the environment and advancing the economy. You can advance both at the same time. And myself and Carlos Corbella, who work very closely with the Environmental Defense Fund, a really phenomenal environmental organization with reach throughout the country, particularly in DC. We did something very bold as Republicans. We instituted and offered up a carbon tax, $24 per metric ton, which would actually exceed the standards under the Paris Accord. We think that bringing that bipartisan agreement together, which actually brought business and the environment together, which is not easy to do, I will tell you, they came together on this bill. And advancing things like that, earmarking that money to infrastructure, which everybody realizes is very antiquated in this country. Not just roads and schools and bridges, what we call overhead infrastructure, but covert infrastructure, the IT infrastructure, the electrical grid, subterraneous water piping. This is a way to fund and rebuild our infrastructure, which is going to be needed for the growing economy. And that's the way to do it, is through green energy jobs.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Wallace?
Briefly on the tax issue, I'm getting tired of this stunt that he pulls to challenge the release of tax returns. He has voted 18 times to prevent the release of Donald Trump's tax returns, and then he introduces a bill which says we must release the tax returns of presidential candidates. Who does he exempt? Donald Trump. Let's have enough of the political stunts. On green energy, on energy, renewable energy independence. I support an immediate transition to renewable energy, 100% renewable. I don't believe in natural gas as a transition fuel. Natural gas releases more greenhouse gases than even coal. When you consider the release of methane during the mining process, methane is 84 times more potent as a heat-trapping gas than CO2 is. We have to commit, like an Apollo project, we have to commit right now to solar, wind, and new sources of energy, gravitational research that is going on right now. There is a lot we can do. It takes a huge national commitment. There are currently more solar jobs in America than coal. It's the fastest growing energy segment in the world. China's getting it, India's getting it. They are eating our lunch on producing renewable energy. And we have to make a huge national commitment, bold and brave and immediate.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to pass over to my co-moderator, Sandy Matson, to ask questions at this point.
If the audience has additional questions that they haven't turned in, please hand them toward the side aisles, although I can assure you we have more questions than we're going to get through. And I may move to some of yours during the questions from the League of Women Voters of Bucks County. This goes first to Mr. Wallace, I believe, unless I've lost track. It's a question related to the national deficit is rising. Would you support changes to Social Security and Medicare to address the deficit?
No. The only change I would support to Social Security is to make it more solvent over the indefinite future. And the way to do that is to remove the cap on rich people paying into it. Currently, you don't pay Social Security taxes on any income above $131,000. Now, there's been talk, if you raise that $10,000 to $140,000, you could make it solvent for the next 10 or 20 years. I say remove it completely. Why is Bill Gates' second billion-dollar income protected when his first $131,000 is not? This is part of the rich paying their fair share. This is how we solve what is called the entitlement problem. These are programs that people paid into with every paycheck. Social Security and Medicare, and I think it's a travesty to give goodies to the top 1% and corporations and then expect everybody else in this room, everybody else in this country to pay for it. out of their precious earned benefits. I would keep it solvent. I would look at other ways to improve, to bring down the debt. By the way, the national deficit went up 17% this week by new estimates, $779 billion deficit. A record deficit. Why? Because we put in place these tax cuts that benefit so few at the cost of so many. So yes, there's a lot we can do, and it involves making the 1% pay their fair share. Thank you.
Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Oop. That's for you, Carlo. Scott says the 1% need to pay their fair share. I couldn't agree more. He's the 1% of the 1%. If you saw his tax returns, folks, he's not paying his fair share. He can dispute it. Scott, the offer's open. Leadership starts at home. We could set an example for the country. You keep saying no. A lot would be learned if you saw them, folks. That's what I'll tell you. On Social Security, we absolutely need to preserve it. No structural changes. There are two things that will increase the payment streams for our senior population, including my parents, both in their mid-80s, both who live on their Social Security. Number one, both bills which I'm a co-sponsor of, Tax-Free Social Security Act of 2018, making all payment streams to seniors tax-free. Social Security in and of itself is a product of taxation. It should not be taxed on disbursement and receipt by our senior population. The second thing is tying Social Security benefits to something called the CPIE, another bill that I'm on, Consumer Price Index for the Elderly. It's not just the CPI which tracks typical inflation. CPIE is a specific inflationary measure specifically to our senior population, because oftentimes inflationary prices are very different for our senior population who are on medication, need hospital products and the like. That's how we secure Social Security two ways. Having a rock solid policy, as I do, never to make structural changes, having pro-growth economic policies that are going to bring revenues into the government so we have the financial ability to fund Social Security, and then those two legislative pieces which will increase the payment stream to seniors.
Next question for Mr. Fitzpatrick on the minimum wage. Current federal minimum wage is $7.25, which for an individual working 40 hours a week would gross approximately $15,000 per year. Do you support raising the minimum wage? And if so, to what level and how you would do it? Or if you're opposed, why would you not raise it?
Yes, it does need to be raised, and we need to relabel it from minimum wage to livable wage. What we need to do is identify the cost of living for every locality, for single parents, for families of four, for single individuals, identify what a livable wage is, attach it to the CPI so it tracks real inflation and deflation, and get it out of politics. That's what we ought to do, because every single human being that is working should be able to pay for cost of living expenses. It's an absurd situation where people are working and they can't afford to live, because what that does, it creates an incentive for people not to work, which we have now in this country. There are scenarios where it actually is more cost effective for people not to work than to work. And those are the changes that need to be made.
Mr. Wallace.
Well, I agree that the minimum wage should be increased. It should have been increased many years ago. I would support an increase to $15 an hour. I think we can do it over time, so it's not a shock to small businesses. And I agree that Social Security benefits should be indexed to the CPIE, the elderly CPI, because there's a different mix of expenses there. But I think we need broader changes to our system of tax equity in America. It's not just lifting up the bottom. It's more fairness, less loopholes for the wealthy. Real estate developers in this country have a system that they can game completely, like Donald Trump and Jared Kushner, where there are loopholes that you do not ever have to pay any taxes at all. We should remove the tax incentives for the drilling of fossil fuels and substitute for them incentives for the creation of clean energy. There's a lot we can do with the tax code to make it more fair, more equitable, and as I've mentioned before, increasing the amount that the top 1% has to pay. Make them pay their fair share. Bring down the top, lift up the bottom. A rising tide should lift all boats, not just the yachts.
Thank you. The next question will be for you, Mr. Wallace, on immigration. Do you support requiring immigrants who are unlawfully present in the United States to return to their country of origin before they are eligible for citizenship?
No, I think we have to design a comprehensive immigration reform that makes sense, that allows some sort of pathway to citizenship for the 11 million people who are here without documentation. I don't know if we need to do the charade of sending them back so they can come back. There are other ways to do that without disrupting families for months, perhaps years. I do support comprehensive immigration reform. I was working for Senator Al Simpson, Republican of Wyoming, at the time that he passed our last huge immigration reform bill in 1986, and boy, it was not easy. You have to balance these competing needs of border security and the rights of families who've been here for 30 years and raised children who are Americans themselves, and some sort of accountability for the employers who benefit from illegal immigration, employer sanctions. It is not easy, but I can tell you one thing that we have to do immediately. There are a couple of immediate problems. The dreamers, the kids who were brought here when they were young through no fault of their own, we need to give them immediate relief. We need to fix the family reunification problem at the border. There's still 435 children at the border who are separated from their parents. Mr. Fitzpatrick is on the Homeland Security Committee. I would be out there filing subpoenas to bring the immigration people in to say, how the hell are you letting this happen and why aren't you fixing it?
No applause, please. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
The Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus has an immigration reform package that is bipartisan. Jimmy Panetta, who's Leon Panetta's son, drafted it. I helped him with that. He and I interviewed together on Telemundo to explain what it is. It's got it, and it addresses everything. It addresses the border component, it addresses the E-Verify component, it addresses the guest ag worker component, it addresses the DACA piece, it addresses the undocumented immigrant piece. To answer your question, Sandy, no, there shouldn't be deportation. That's an absurd suggestion. It doesn't work. It's inhumane. It's unbecoming of American values. What we do need to do is, for once, we gotta solve this immigration crisis. 1986 was the last immigration rewrite. Think of how much has changed in U.S.-Mexican relations, how much has changed at the border, the drug problem that has increased with El Chapo and his drug lords, the MS-13 problem, all these challenges that have exacerbated, and because of extreme partisanship, which Scott's a big believer in, he'll tell you he's not, but when he says he's on the Democrat team and I'm on the Republican team, should tell you all you need to know. The only way forward is if we expand the Problem Solvers Caucus. We are the ones coming up with the bipartisan solutions that have centrist Democrats and Republicans coming together. People are allowing the so-called perfect to be the enemy of the good, both on the far right and the far left, because they're digging in and they're insisting on ideological purity in their bills, and anything short of that they vote no on. And as long as that Hatfield and McCoy mentality continues and perpetuates, the problem is going to continue to get kicked down the road.
If you want to remain. This is a question on gun safety. What measures can or should Congress take to protect students in schools in relation to gun violence?
Yep. So I speak to you as someone who carried a gun around my ankle for 14 years for the purposes of keeping people safe and saving lives, and also as a federal gun crimes prosecutor who put away dangerous criminals who violated our nation's gun laws. That was my professional career before entering Congress. Since entering Congress, been the leader in gun violence, and gun prevention, and gun safety. Gabby Giffords has endorsed us. Every Town for Gun Safety has endorsed us. We just got another one this week. The Brady campaign has endorsed us. Literally every single gun safety organization in this country has endorsed us because they know that we, and myself, and our team are playing the leadership role, doing everything we can to bring a bipartisan compromise together, because folks, I will tell you, the Republicans have failed, the Democrats have failed. When they control the House, the Senate, and the White House, nothing gets done. And the reason nothing gets done is because, again, the extreme hyperpartisanship, which brings us back to the problem solvers. We have a gun safety package in place, universal background checks, which Scott apparently thinks I oppose. I actually authored the bill with Mike Thompson. Whole other discussion. Assault weapons bans, gun violent restraining order, all those things that we could go on and on about the legislative package. It's on the website. Everything that we need to do to enhance gun safety and addressing the mental health crisis we have in this country.
Mr. Wallace.
There we go again about the Problem Solvers Caucus, about immigration, about guns. I haven't seen those problems solved yet. I'm still waiting. Now he talks about endorsements from some gun groups. All these groups have a challenge. These are tax-exempt organizations. They must have one Republican to be able to say they are bipartisan. Some of them have chosen Brian. I've been endorsed by Mayor Bloomberg himself, the #1 gun control advocate in America. I've been endorsed by Moms Demand Action, and when the national Moms Demand Action went for Brian Fitzpatrick, the local group here disbanded and created a new group to endorse me. I was endorsed yesterday by Newtown parents, Newtown, Connecticut, Demand Action. We have to do things that are not on the problem solvers agenda. We have to ban assault weapons. We have to ban high-capacity magazines. We have to ban bump stock silencers. We have to remove the ridiculous legal liability, immunity, that Congress granted to the gun industry in 2005 at the request of the NRA. And I would require biometric trigger locks on every gun in America. Newtown was a 17-year-old disturbed boy who took his mother's gun and killed 20 preschoolers. If that gun had been equipped with a fingerprint recognition technology, that tragedy could not have happened. There's a lot we can do. He refuses to sign on to the assault weapons ban as much as he talks about wanting to do something about it. There's a bill out there with 176 co-sponsors that he's not on.
Mr. Wallace, this will be for you. It's the last question that's from the League of Women Voters of Bucks County related to campaign finance reform, but in particular to what in Congress is the Disclose Act, which requires groups that have formed that are 527s or 501c4s who can accept money and spend money as long as they don't coordinate, but they do not have to disclose their donors. What is your position on that? Would you support the Disclose Act or something similar to address that issue?
Yes, I totally support the Disclose Act and legislation which would similarly, through the FEC, require all publicly traded corporations to disclose their political donors. Justice Kennedy, when he wrote the Citizens United decision, assumed that, of course, Congress would require disclosure of corporate political donations, but the Republican Congress voted it down repeatedly. It's the bare minimum. Just let us see what they're doing so that the consumers of America can decide, do I want to buy Coke, do I want to buy Pepsi, which one endorsed which party. When you have disclosure, corporations will say, wait a minute, I don't want to jeopardize my customer base, we won't do any of this. And that's our ultimate goal. Ultimately, I think we need to amend the Constitution to overturn Citizens United, to finally allow Congress to strictly regulate corporate money and politics. There should be a flat law passed, as Teddy Roosevelt passed in 1906, the Tillman Act, to say no corporate money ever in politics. They are not human beings. They don't have feelings. They only have one interest, and that's their bottom line. They should not be players in American politics. And we should strictly regulate the time and the amount of spending in elections. In England, they have a 6-week window. You can only raise money, spend money, and campaign for 6 weeks before the election. And you can only spend like $10,000. Wouldn't that make all of our lives a lot easier?
Time. No applause, please. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
I do support the Disclose Act, and in, let's say, March or April of 2010, when the Citizens United decision was released, I was national supervisor of the FBI's political corruption unit. Bob Mueller was my boss. I got called up to his office, and he wanted to know, what effect is this going to have on corruption cases? I said, sir, it's going to increase them, because money is the root of all evil. Money in politics leads to more corruption cases. There's no question about it. And I want to get the money out of politics. And I got to say, I always chuckle, Scott, every time you talk about money in politics and corporate money in politics. This is a man who inherited $300 million from DuPont. DuPont. The company, by the way, that created PFAS and PFOA that are poisoning our water here, he's still making money off it. True. It is.
Incorrect.
True. It is true. This man has spent $10
It
million.
was 3M.
This is my time, Scott. Thank you. And it is DuPont. And they created Agent Orange as well.
Incorrect. That was Dow and
Wait,
Monsanto.
all right.
Scott, is this my time?
All right.
My
Gentlemen.
time. So the man that says that corporate money in politics is the problem has put $10 million of corporate money into this race. So he doesn't like corporate money in politics, but he carves out a big exception for Scott Wallace's money. That's okay. All the other money's bad. I agree money's bad. And I want to end by saying this. In addition to wanting him to disclose his tax returns, there was a second thing that I asked him a long time ago. I've raised millions, he's worth millions. I said, let's cap spending. Let's give money to all the amazing charities in Bucks County. Bucks County Opportunity Council, Big Brothers Big Sisters,
Please.
Habitat for Humanity, all these charities
Time
that
is-
let this community survive. He said no.
Time.
So the guy that says no money in politics wants as much money as
Time,
he can in
Mr.
politics.
Fitzpatrick.
Patrick, give me a moment. I have a question for you. I asked the audience to please. You all said you would, so please. Thank you.
All right, we're going to turn to the questions that you submitted, many more than we can answer. And we will alternate as moderators asking the questions. It remains 90-second responses. So the first question will go to Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Business growth is essential to Bucks County. What will you do to leverage government programs to help local businesses prosper? Please provide some details.
Yeah, first detail is last week, $1.7 million in a Department of Labor grant. 67 counties in Bucks County, only 2 got grants. We were one of them in Bucks County. And the reason, coming back to bipartisanship, folks, that is what gets things done. It got us that grant. It's the reason we were able, as a freshman, to get 4 monumental bills passed through the House and Senate, signed into law by the President. Right to Try, Victor Saraceni, the Aviation Security Act, Children of Fallen Heroes Scholarship Fund, and a whole host of others. It's through bipartisanship. What do? We get grants. We support our workforce development programs here. We bolster our 3 VOTEC schools. We're very fortunate to have 3, South, Central, and North in Bucks County. And we start getting to filling those 7.1 million unfilled jobs in this country by dealing with the opioid epidemic, which I'm the vice chair of the National Bipartisan Heroin Task Force. That's been my sole focus on that addiction crisis. And getting to the workforce training and development. Those are concrete steps that we can get people into these unfilled jobs.
Thank you. Mr. Wallace.
Well, I totally agree that stimulating small business entrepreneurship should be a high priority. The Small Business Administration is currently run by a woman who ran the National Wrestling Federation. I'm not sure that's the best qualified person to build small businesses in America. But between the Department of Labor, the Department of Commerce, and the Small Business Administration, I agree we should have robust grant programs to promote innovation and entrepreneurship. We were recently in Israel. I think they do a much better job of setting up entrepreneurial hubs and of providing specific innovation grants to stimulate young people to start their own businesses. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement. I think a more robust congressional oversight role, calling in the leaders of these agencies and asking them to do more would be a priority for mine going into the next Congress.
Mr. Wallace, a question on education loans. I recently paid off my student loans. My wife still has hers. The money I was spending on my loan is now going towards saving for my son's future education. What are your plans to address the student debt crisis hampering mine and future generations?
It's just a huge problem. The cost of education has gone up far higher than the cost of the consumer price index. There are a lot of reasons for that, but we have to deal specifically with students with these incredible $100,000, $200,000 loan debt problems. The biggest problem, I think, is the lenders that are making money off these loans. We have to prevent for-profit lenders. We have to rein them in. We have to make sure that the loan rates are not usurious and are fair to students. And as I say, my ultimate goal is public college and university. You should be allowed to graduate debt-free. If we took back 1% of the corporate tax cut, raised the corporate tax rate from 21% to 22%. We could devote all of that money and solve the student debt crisis and make it possible for every student to graduate debt-free. That's some $600 billion we could free up by that one simple change. So I'm all in favor of it.
Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Now, there's two pieces to that puzzle. Number one is the issue of student interest on loans. The second is the actual cost of college education itself. So what we are advancing is something called the Know Before You Go Act. It's a full transparency measure for everybody entering any secondary institution. For every dollar you spend on tuition, full transparency and disclosure on what percent of that dollar goes to educating students, what percent of that dollar goes to placing students into jobs, what percent is overhead, is R&D, administrative salaries. So every single student in this country knows, no matter where they go, how those universities are spending that money. And then fully subsidizing student interest loans as close to zero as possible. Because we're trying to get people to jumpstart their careers early on, and this is where that alternative path in the VOTEC fields comes in as well at college. Offering that dual track and students that do choose secondary education, making it as affordable as possible. And there's two pieces to that. The cost of college education is way too high, but it's due to a lack of transparency. People don't know where their money is going, and that's a good step for the federal government.
Mr. Fitzpatrick, this is a two-part question. This is a bipartisan issue. What specifically are you going to do to engage the other side for more bipartisan decisions? And here's part two. How are you going to get these bills to the floor when the Congress rules may not allow them to be put into the floor?
Yeah. Scott likes to mock the problem solvers. I will repeat it. The only thing that's going to save this country. Josh Gottheimer, my Democrat colleague, he's a Democrat in New Jersey. I'm a Republican. He came to my district to support me. My Democrat colleagues in Congress that are part of the Problem Solvers Caucus, my closest friends in Congress. We respect each other as human beings. We care about each other's families. We want to co-sponsor bills together. We want to see each other succeed in each other's districts. That caucus is the future of the United States of America. It's the only thing that's going to save our country. And we need to expand it, not shrink it. And the Break the Gridlock package, which I meant, that is what's going to fundamentally change the way the rules are written in the House of Representatives so that these bills do get to the floor. One of the many provisions, and you can look it up, I encourage everybody here to go to nolabels.org. If you go to that website and you look at their policies, you will know everything that I believe to my core is so important about the structural changes we need to make to Congress. Because if you have a broken system, it's garbage in, garbage out. And we've gone out on a limb to say we will only support a speaker candidate that supports those rules changes. These are bold steps. And it's necessary because if we're going to get these bipartisan bills to the floor, they will pass. Immigration reform will pass. Criminal justice reform will pass. Transportation infrastructure will pass. All the things that have been jammed up for decades when both parties are in control and both parties are rigid ideologues. And that's what's got to stop. The Problem Solvers folks, please look at their website. That is the only thing that's going to save our country.
Thank you, sir.
Look, the Problem Solvers Caucus is good talk, but you have a leadership in the House of Representatives now, Paul Ryan, somebody else presumably next time, who will not bring these floors to Congress, these bills to the floor of Congress. They will not bring a gun control bill. They will not bring environmental regulation bills. They will block them up. They will never see the light of day. You wrote a bill on a carbon tax, 24%, which, by the way, is far less than the Exxon bill.
Which one is $24 per metric ton.
$24 per metric ton.
And both parties have failed to get gun violence off.
And 3 days before you introduced that bill, Paul Ryan ran through a resolution on the floor of the House saying that under no circumstances will this House of Representatives ever even consider the concept of a carbon tax. And by the way, $24 per ton is far less than the ExxonMobil bill, which had a $40 tax per ton. We have to have a change of leadership. The secret is not just a label and photo op trips to the border to see the children in cages. The secret is, as I said in my opening statement, bipartisan fact gathering. Use facts, science, the stories of real people who've been sprayed by Agent Orange, who've gotten health problems that aren't curable. Examine the truth, the facts and the science, and from that will come bipartisan consensus. You can't argue with truth. You can't argue with facts and science. That's where we bring people together.
Okay, Mr. Wallace, this is an environmental and a trade question together. The questioner states that the recently renegotiated NAFTA, in this person's opinion, falls short in protecting our environment, job outsourcing, and human rights. Will you commit to seeing it fixed to assure these protections are there before approving it in the next session of Congress?
Yes, I think NAFTA can be improved more. I think every trade agreement we have has to have protections for labor and environmental protections. It is somewhat of an improvement, but trade is the window through which we can start to bring equity back to our economic system, our tax system. So we need open trade, but fair trade with labor and environmental protections.
Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Yeah, both labor and environmental standards do need to be protected, and we need to renegotiate deals that benefit the United States of America. We've been running on annual $800 billion or so trade deficits every single year, which manifests itself in the bleeding of United States jobs, which tends to increase unemployment, which reduces revenue to the federal government, which means we have less money to fund our national priorities. Smart trade policy is really important. Yes, it has to protect environmental standards and labor standards, and it also has to benefit the American worker. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with looking with a very scrutinizing eye at every single trade agreement we have, and if it benefits the United States of America, renegotiate it. It's going to just increase our booming economy that we have right now. It's very, very important.
Mr. Fitzpatrick, what are your plans to support the much-needed reform to our criminal justice system?
So the Problem Solvers Caucus, which he mocks, brought together Van Jones and Jared Kushner on this issue. How many issues can you bring Van Jones and Jared Kushner together on? They came to our Problem Solvers Caucus meeting and have helped us draft criminal justice legislation, which is now subject to a vote on the committee, or the way our caucus works. If we have 75% of the members of the committee, of the caucus, to agree to a yes, and 50% of each party's members agree to a yes, we agree to vote as a block. A block that currently stands at 48 members. If we can get to 60 members, we become the new governing majority in Congress, a bipartisan governing majority of Congress, with a block of 60 votes in the center that can actually get these things done. Treating criminal justice and incarceration, understanding that the release rate is typically 85% of prisoners are going to get out at some point. So we have to train them and prepare them to re-enter society in a way that they can contribute to the economy, contribute to our country, reducing the stigma of having been previously incarcerated, and not just having these factories. That doesn't benefit anybody. We have to make sure that if they're incarcerated, that they're actually building themselves up, given the fact that 85% of them are going to be released.
Mr. Wallace?
Sure. I've spent the bulk of my legal career working on criminal justice reform. It's not easy, but the bipartisan consensus is coming along pretty nicely, or at least it was until Mr. Trump came in. We've done a little backsliding since then. I have always asked the question, if America has 5% of the world's population, why do we have 25% of the world's prisoners? Why do we have the highest incarceration rate in the world? We just passed Russia. Why does Pennsylvania now spend more on incarceration than we do on higher education? We're making some foolish policy choices. I've managed a number of projects for the U.S. Department of Justice trying to answer that question. How do we make the criminal justice system more effective at its real purpose, which, by the way, is reducing crime, not locking people up, and less costly? And so what we did was bring together all the components of the criminal justice system: judges, prosecutors, defenders, and social service providers, and figure out how we can work together to address not just the offense that happened that day, but the offender. Does he have a drug problem? Does he have a mental health issue? Is he PSD? Is he homeless? If you solve those underlying problems, then you won't see them come back every year, year after year, with the underlying problem unaddressed. So I've been on the board of the National Association of Drug Court Professionals for 10 years, doing these collaborations, and I believe in them across the board, and we'll work to promote them.
Mr. Wallace, would you support term limits for members of Congress and Supreme Court justices?
I support term limits for every elected official, and the means by which we do that is the vote. And you have that opportunity coming up in 18 days to make your choice, to throw out people you don't want and to put in people that you do. I do not want someone telling me if I think I've got the greatest senator in the world, Daniel Patrick Moynihan or Ted Kennedy. They did their best work in their third and fourth decades, best legislators in the history of Congress. If they represent me, I think it's highly undemocratic to tell me I can't have them as my representative. But if you don't like them, throw them out. Term limits are a bogus issue. It's a cover for the real problem, which is the advantage that incumbents have, which is all the money that flows their way because they're in Congress and they have power. Stop the corporate money in politics. That's a great proxy for reducing the power of incumbency, which addresses the underlying concern, which is totally legitimate. And there was a second part.
Supreme Court justices.
Oddly, I've come to believe that yes, we should have term limits on Supreme Court justices. The idea of life tenure, 40 years, for someone who passed 5149 and maybe is not the greatest choice. I think a 9-year term, a 15-year term, one term and out might be better for democracy.
Thank you, Mr.
Mr.
Wallace.
Fitzpatrick.
Sorry.
Well, I couldn't disagree more, Scott, on legislative term limits. One of the first bills I introduced was a broad sweeping set of government reform bills which talked about term limits. I will tell you, I don't think there's any more important change that we can make in this country than legislative term limits. George Washington was my favorite president ever. He did two things that set us on a very different course. He resigned his military commission. Every country that did the opposite ended up with a kingship or a dictatorship. He also started the tradition of term limits. All he wanted to do was to go back to his farm in Mount Vernon, live under the laws he helped pass, make way for a new generation of leadership. That is the most organic, healthiest form of democracy you can have. They talked him into a second term. He said no more. It's a tradition that every single president honored up until FDR, at which point Congress passed the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution. But true to form, they applied it to the executive. They didn't apply it to themselves. We need to apply it to themselves. I introduced a bill. My Democrat freshman colleague, Ro Khanna, who represents Silicon Valley, interestingly grew up here in Bucks County, went to Council Rock High School. We went into the Oval Office and we said, we got to get this done. And we will get it done. We will get this done. And I can tell you, as somebody who ran the political corruption unit at FBI headquarters, it was rare, if ever, that we would indict a politician 2, 3, 4 years in office. Far more likely 15, 20, 25 years in office, because what we saw was the most well-intended, principled, backbone people that enter that system. The lines that were really bright on day one weren't so bright in year 5 or 8 or 10 or 20 or 50. Term limits are very, very important, and I'm a big believer in it.
Thank you.
Mr. Fitzpatrick, why should Social Security be taxed? What will you do to help improve the retirements of our seniors?
Yeah, so this came up before. I have two bills that I am a co-sponsor of and actively pursuing pushing. The No Tax on Social Security Act of 2018 to make payment streams tax-free for our senior population and tying benefits to CPIE. Both of those will dramatically increase the payment streams to seniors, coupling with solidifying the structure of Social Security and making it an unequivocal social safety net that is always there, always there. I'm a firm believer in that. That cuts to the core of everything I believe in. My legislative staff will tell you that I told them early on day one, if there is any bill that jeopardizes that, I'm a no on. And that's our ironclad position in our office.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Wallace.
One follow-up on term limits. I just want to promise you that I personally will term limit myself, no more than 3 terms. And ironically, my grandfather was a great beneficiary of the lack of term limits. He served as vice president in Franklin Roosevelt's 3rd term. But it was a time that actually worked for America because World War II was underway and people wanted to stay with the president they had. On Social Security, yes, we've addressed this. I agree with my esteemed colleague over here. No tax on Social Security benefits. Use the CPIE for elderly people's expenses. And as I said before, lift the cap on the taxable income that goes into Social Security to maintain its long-term solvency. Do not raise the retirement age, do not cut benefits. We can maintain a full, vibrant Social Security system to protect seniors into the indefinite future if we lift the income cap.
Mr. Wallace, this is a question on legalizing marijuana, both for medical and recreational use, and I'd like you to address it from the role of Congress in this issue as opposed to the role of the states.
Sure, good question. I support Congress getting out of the way of state experimentation. Lots of states have experimented with medical marijuana. Some have chosen recreational marijuana. They are raking in hundreds of millions of dollars of tax revenues. To my knowledge, to this date, there has not been one single overdose death by marijuana in the history of America. And yet, the federal government has marijuana listed on Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act. That means it's a category that has zero medical benefits and the highest potential for abuse. It's up there with heroin and crack and meth. No, it belongs at least on Schedule 5, which is proven medical benefits and the lowest potential for abuse. I personally would just take it off completely. It is less dangerous than alcohol, and alcohol is fully legalized in this country. And if you want to talk about gateway drugs to more serious drugs, alcohol is number one. So I favor states deciding what they want to do. I think the evidence shows so far that it's a net benefit. No increase in crime, no appreciable increase in drug use, and huge increases in state revenue, and savings to the criminal justice system in terms of wasting time and money on court cases, judges, prosecutors, public defenders, and treatment resources.
Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Medicinal use, I think, is very helpful. There are two different components to marijuana. There's a THC, which is the hallucinogenic, and then there's a medical piece. The medical piece has actually been separated out. The FDA is now reporting to the DEA recommending that they delist that medical piece. So the question really becomes, and I think it's important to involve the physician community here, it's important to involve the recovery community here. It's a very legitimate conversation to have, given this opioid crisis that we're facing across the country, which has hit our community, unfortunately, particularly hard, on what the best mechanism on re-evaluating the way we look at pain management. Opioids are very, very addictive. We need to take a hard look at marijuana and bring in the physician community, because I can tell you they have their concerns, and we ought to hear them out. Their concerns is that a lot of this stuff is untested, unverified on what the long-term impacts are. So should it be ruled out? Of course not. In fact, it could potentially be a very, very positive path in the area of pain management, which gets into getting past the opioid epidemic.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzpatrick, for you. The Congressional Accountability Act allows secret taxpayer funds to settle workplace sexual harassment and discrimination suits against members of Congress. Do you support the use of taxpayer money for the enforcement of victims signing non-disclosure agreements?
Of course not. Of course not. We issued strong statements when we saw this epidemic across the country in the corporate boardrooms, in the media outlets, in Congress, throughout America. Of course you should not use taxpayer funds ever, and we've signed on to multiple bills, bipartisan bills, to prevent that from ever happening.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Wallace?
Of course, this is an easy one for us to agree on. It's ridiculous to pay taxpayer money to settle personal sexual claims by members of Congress. I think we have a deeper problem than just members of Congress behaving badly and spending taxpayer money to settle it. I think we have a huge problem at the top of this country with misogyny, with ignoring the rights of women, with not listening to women, as exemplified in the Kavanaugh hearings, with a phony charade FBI investigation into the allegations of 3 women, none of the potential corroborators. There was not a